Alright, we are here with part 4 of this little mini series on ways to add a fringe, or whatever you want to call it, to the ends of your handmade scarf. So far I've shown you how to add a classic fringe, tassels, pom-poms, and this week I'm showing you how to add a fabric tassel to the end of your handmade scarves. Now before we get into the tutorial, I do just want to quickly mention one of the reasons that I really like adding something to the ends of my scarves is because it's a great way to add length to your scarves without using as much yarn. Case in point, I made this lovely scarf from a skein of Lion Brand's Ferris wheel yarn, and I really wanted to make the scarf using just one skein, but it was a little on the short side, so to add the illusion of length, I added tassels to the ends. Also, this scarf pattern will be available in my Etsy store very soon, hopefully, so you can check that out there if you want to get a hold of this pattern. But anyways, this is one of the reasons I love adding things to the ends of my scarves, so let's learn how to add a fabric fringe. Before we get started, I wanted to show you what it looks like once we've added the fabric tassels. Basically, one side we have it sewn on there, which you can see my stitching pretty obviously because of my thread color choice. But on the other side you don't really notice it, and quite honestly I don't mind the one side looking a little different. So now that we understand what it's supposed to look like, let's go ahead and add some fabric tassels to our crochet or knit scarf. If I'm going to add fabric tassels, of course I need fabric. I have this old shirt that I'm going to cut up and use, and I need to make sure both of my tassels end up being the same size. So what I did was I took a piece of cardstock and cut it to be the width of my scarf. Then I decided how long do I actually want my tassels to hang, and I cut it to that length. A paper slicer is really handy for this step, so you make sure you end up with right angles and nice smooth cuts. But essentially what I've done is create a template for myself to cut out my fabric. I decided to do my tassels 2 different colors on this one, different colors at each end, and I've got some fabric scissors here. Like I said, I'm cutting from an old shirt, so I'm going to cut a straight line up here, and then I will use my template to cut out my square. So as I've got my first edge cut, I'm going to place my little rectangle of paper on top of it and cut along the top edge. Now, I am no seamstress. I really struggle with sewing, so I'm sure there are better ways to do this, to cut out your rectangles, but this is the method that I found worked best for me. And you will need to lift your fabric off the table a little bit so you can get the scissors underneath. One last side. Another option too is to flip it over with your fabric kind of supported by the cardstock, but just make sure you don't cut the cardstock with the scissors, as it will dull your scissors. And now I have a nice little rough rectangle. At this point I need to cut my tassels out. You of course can measure this and do this super precise. I just eyeballed it and hacked away, but I am going to make sure I end up with the same number of tassels on my second end as I did on my first. My first one I happened to cut it into 7 tassels, so I'm going to make sure that I do 6 cuts along here to create those same 7 tassels. I'm going to start at the right edge here and trim straight towards the top. But we're not going to cut all the way through the top because we need it to stay attached just a little bit. Also, if you have a cutting mat and one of those little roller cutters, this would go a lot faster, but I'm not fancy enough to have one of those. So now that I've got it cut, it's time to attach it to the end of our scarf. I'm going to use a needle and thread to sew it on. So the camera's probably not focusing on this, but basically I'm just threading my needle right now. And then I'm going to keep it doubled up and pull a nice long section, trim it, and then tie my 2 ends together. Just keeping them together and doing kind of an overhand knot. And then I'll tie several more times to make that knot a little bit bigger. So now I've got a knot at one end, my needle at the other, and it's time to start sewing. Now as I mentioned, one end you see the stitching, the other side you don't really. I'm going to keep the stitching on the same side of my scarf. So the side that's face up here is the same side that has the stitching on the other end of the scarf. But basically I'm going to stick this piece on top of my scarf, overlapping it just a little bit, pick an end to start at, and I'm going to run my needle through my tassels and the scarf. And then to stitch this, I'm just going to do a really basic up and down stitch where I just come down a little further, come up through my scarf and my fabric, then go back down through both of them, come back up, go back down. Now if you're really good with the sewing machine, you can do this on a machine. Sewing machines, they just really hate me, and I find it very hard to sew crochet items through a sewing machine, so that's what I'm going by hand. But I'm going to repeat this all the way down the end of my scarf. Be careful though that you don't pull your stitching too tight or it will cause the end of your scarf to bunch. Another thing too, you can match your thread color better to your fabric. I just went with a random color. Here I've stitched all the way down to the end, and on the back side I'm just going to knot this off. Run some of the threads from stitching, you can run it through the fabric of your scarf, however you want to tie it off. And in this long piece I will just run through the material of my scarf to disguise it. If we come back to the end where we started, we've also got a little piece sticking out, so I'm just going to run my needle through the scarf, feed my tail ends through the eye of my needle, and then feed it through the scarf. And that is how I attach the fabric tassels to the end of my handmade scarf. Here is how this look turns out. I think this is so cute and so fun, and I love how it adds a different texture to your project because you can use a more woven or machine knit fabric to contrast with whatever yarn you made your scarf out of. So I hope y'all have enjoyed this series. If you did, let me know by leaving a thumbs up on the video, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you're not already one of my crafters. I've got some fun projects planned for next month on Tuesdays, so definitely want to check those out. And also I am going to be doing a series on crochet borders, so make sure you come back to my channel next week for a tutorial Tuesday and the start of that new crochet series. I'll see you in my next video, and until then, happy crafting!